The Chamber of Common Voices sat at the center of a station older than most of the species who governed from it. It had been carved once from a single asteroid of pale stone, and the builders of that age had ground the interior walls smooth and set them with veins of a metal that caught light and held it, so that even in the deepest cycle of station night the great hall glowed faintly, like the inside of a shell. 11,000 delegates could be seated in its tiers. On the day the warning came, perhaps a fifth of that number were present, which was considered a full session, because the matters brought before the council in those years were rarely urgent and never, in the memory of anyone living, catastrophic. The Galactic Council had governed for 11,000 standard years. It had done so, its members liked to say, by the simple and unglamorous virtue of never being surprised. Every threat that mattered had been catalogued. Every hazard had a protocol. The great predators of the early galaxy had been mapped and fenced. The dying suns had been logged and their worlds evacuated on schedules that spanned generations. There was a serenity to the council that came from the certainty that nothing new could happen, because everything had already happened somewhere to someone and been written down. Into this serenity walked a human. Her name was Renna Vos, and she was 26 standard years old, which among her own people made her young but not a child, and among the species assembled in that chamber made her scarcely more than a spore. She wore the plain gray of the Human Survey Corps, unpressed from a long transit, and she carried nothing but a data slate and the particular stillness of someone who has not slept in a long time and has stopped noticing. She had crossed 19 jumps to reach the chamber. She had spent 4 of those jumps rehearsing what she would say, and by the 5th she had stopped rehearsing, because she had understood that the words did not matter. Only the data mattered. She believed this the way the young believe things, completely, and it would be some time before the galaxy taught her otherwise. The speaker for the session was a Theli, one of the tall, slow, courteous people whose homeworld orbited a red star, and whose entire civilization was built around the idea that patience was the highest form of intelligence. The Theli lived a very long time. This one, whose name glyph translated roughly as deep considered tide, had presided over the chamber for 600 years, and had, in all that time, never once seen a petition that could not wait. "The chair recognizes the delegation of the human conquered," said Deep Considered Tide, in the flat synthesized common tongue that the translators fed to every ear in the room. "The petitioner will state her matter. She will observe that the session calendar allocates her a single measure. She is asked to be concise." A single measure. Renna knew what that meant. It meant 11 minutes. She had come 19 jumps and 11,000 years of institutional weight was arrayed against her, and she had 11 minutes. She stepped to the petitioner's stone, a raised disc in the center of the tiers, and she set her data slate down on the reader, and the great veined walls dimmed as the room's attention gathered. "Delegates," she said, and her voice, unaugmented, sounded very small under that vast glowing dome. "My name is Renna Vos. I am a survey pilot with the Concord's Deep Reach program. 11 months ago, my ship recorded something in the region your charts label the Quiet Verge. I have come to tell you what it is. I have come to tell you that it is moving. And I have come to tell you that, if this council does nothing, it will reach the inhabited worlds of the 6th arm within 9 years." There was no reaction. Renna had been warned about this. The Theli did not gasp. The Ossic delegates, crystalline and slow, did not shift. The great insected V-Hurl caucus in the upper tiers merely angled their compound eyes. She had expected the silence, and still it unnerved her, because on a human world 9 years and inhabited worlds and moving would have brought people to their feet. "I will show you," she said, and she keyed the slate. Above the petitioner's stone the air filled with light, and the light resolved into a recording. It was not dramatic. That was the first problem Renna had come to understand. The thing in the Quiet Verge was not dramatic to look at. It was a smear. It was a region of space, perhaps a third of a light year across at its leading edge, in which the stars behind it were wrong, not blocked, not dimmed. Wrong. Bent, doubled, shifted toward colors that the stars themselves did not emit, as though something between the survey ship and the distant suns had been quietly editing the light for reasons of its own. This is a standing distortion, Renna said. It does not radiate. It does not answer hails. It has no thermal signature that our instruments can resolve, which should be impossible for an object of this size. It consumes light and it consumes matter and it grows, and I have 11 months of tracking that shows it accelerating along a vector that terminates. She keyed the slate again, and a starfield bloomed, and a thin red line drew itself across the sixth arm, here, at the Ossic homeworld of Veth, and then here at the Theli settlement moons, and then here and here and here. Now at last there was a reaction, though not the one she had hoped for. An Ossic delegate rose. The Ossic were a people of translucent silicate, and when they spoke their bodies chimed faintly, and the translators rendered the chiming into words. The petitioner describes a lensing anomaly, said the Ossic, whose name glyph was facet of the ninth cleaving. The catalog contains 411 documented lensing anomalies. They are the natural consequence of dense matter in transit. The petitioner's instrument has recorded gravitational lensing and mistaken it for an event. This is a common error among species new to deep survey. It is not lensing, Renna said. Lensing does not accelerate. Lensing does not change vector. I have the mass estimates. Whatever is producing this distortion is gaining mass. It is eating. Mass estimates from a survey vessel, said facet of the ninth cleaving, and there was in the chiming something that the translator could not quite render, but that Renna understood anyway, because condescension is the one language that crosses every species barrier without loss. A single vessel, a single instrument, a single observer. The Council does not act on the observation of one. This is the foundation of 11,000 years of stability. We do not chase the fears of individuals across the dark. Then send more than one, Renna said. That's all I'm asking. Send a proper survey wing. Send it now while there's time to reach the verge and confirm and act. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look. The petitioner's measure is 1/3 elapsed, said the speaker mildly. Renna felt something cold settle into her stomach. She had budgeted her minutes carefully, and the procedural machinery of the chamber was spending them for her, one interruption at a time, and she understood that this too was a kind of answer. She looked up at the tiers, at the 11,000 seats a fifth full, at the pale glowing stone, and she made a decision that she would think about for the rest of her life. She stopped arguing about the data. She started telling them the truth. I have been out there, she said, in the Verge, alone for the better part of a year on a survey ship built for two. I have watched this thing for 340 days. I have watched it swallow a comet whole, not shatter it, not deflect it, swallow it, and the comet did not come out the other side, and the distortion got a little larger, and it kept moving. I have run every instrument I have against it until the instruments broke, and then I fixed them and ran them again. And I am telling you, as someone who has stood closer to this thing than anyone alive, that it is not a natural phenomenon, and it is not slowing down, and it does not care that you have a catalog. You govern by never being surprised. I understand that. It's kept the peace for 11,000 years, and I respect it. But there is a first time for everything, and the whole point of a first time is that it isn't in the catalog yet. This is your first time. I am begging you to recognize it while recognizing it still costs you nothing but a survey wing and a little bit of your certainty. For a moment, one moment, she thought she had reached them. The chamber was quiet in a different way. Even the V-hurl had gone still. Then Deep Considered Tide spoke, and the moment closed like water over a stone. The chair thanks the petitioner for her passion, said the speaker. It is noted, and it is admirable, and it is young. The Council will record the observation in the anomaly catalog under provisional designation, pending corroboration by a chartered survey authority. Should a second independent observation confirm the petitioner's estimates, the matter may be raised again at a future session. The petitioner's measure is concluded. The chair recognizes the delegation of the Muralt Trade Compact on the matter of tariff harmonization. And that was it, that was the whole of it, a note in a catalog. A promise that if the thing killed enough people to be observed by someone the council trusted more than her, they would talk about it again. Renna stood on the petitioner's stone for one heartbeat longer than she should have, and then she picked up her data slate, and she walked out of the chamber of common voices past a fifth of 11,000 delegates who had already stopped thinking about her. Behind her, the Muralt were rising to discuss tariffs. The great veined walls glowed. Nothing had happened as far as the council was concerned. Nothing new could happen. That was the whole basis of the peace. She did not go home. This is the thing that mattered most in the end, though no one in the chamber would have believed it of her if they had bothered to wonder. A different young person, dismissed like that, might have gone home to grieve and to be right, quietly and bitterly, from a safe distance. Renna Vos went the other way. She had a ship. It was old and it was slow, and it was hers, the survey vessel that had carried her through the verge, a blunt gray wedge of a thing named the Kestrel's Vigil Asterisk, though everyone who had ever flown her just called her the Vigil Asterisk. And she had made a promise to herself somewhere around the 200th day in the dark, watching the distortion eat a comet, a promise she had not told the council about because she had wanted foolishly to give them the chance to make the promise unnecessary. The promise was this: if they will not go, I will go. If they will not watch, I will watch. Someone has to be there when it arrives, so that at least the record is true. There was a thing the Conquered did in those years, for worlds that were being slowly abandoned or slowly poisoned or slowly forgotten. The worlds that fell between the great motions of galactic policy. They sent keepers. A keeper was a single person, or sometimes two, given a ship and a supply of years and a mandate that could be written on the back of a hand. Watch, record, preserve what can be preserved, and do not leave. It was not a glamorous posting. It was often a punishment, or a place to put people the Conquered did not know what to do with. But Renna Vos, 26 years old, walked out of the chamber of common voices and requested a keeper's mandate for the sixth arm, and because no one else wanted it, and because the paperwork was cheap, she got it. She would be the keeper of the worlds the council would not defend. She would go and stand in front of the thing they refused to see. And when it came, she was certain now that it would come. She would make sure that at least one set of eyes had been open, and at least one voice had been telling the truth, from the very beginning to the very end. The Vigil left dock 4 days later, gray and blunt and alone, and turned her nose toward the sixth arm, and the long fall began. The council did not watch her go. The council was discussing tariffs. 9 years, Renna had said. She had rounded, out of mercy or out of caution. The true figure her instruments gave her was 8 years, 7 months, and a handful of days. She spent the transit doing what keepers did, which was to say she spent it learning the world she had chosen to keep. The sixth arm was not empty. That was the part the catalog never captured, because a catalog records what a thing is and not who lives there. There were 40 inhabited worlds along the red line she had drawn in the chamber, and on those worlds there lived some hundreds of millions of people, of a dozen species, most of them poor, most of them provincial, most of them entirely unaware that a survey pilot had crossed 19 jumps to fail to save them. There were the Ossic quarry cities of Veth, where the silicate people grew their young slowly in vats of warm mineral broth and sang to them in chimes across the generations. There were the Theli settlement moons, terraced with red gardens, where the long-lived gardeners tended orchards they would not live to see fruit. There were the human colonies, the small stubborn ones, mining and fishing and quarreling. There were the V-Hurl hive platforms drifting in the gas giants. There were people. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. There were people, and they did not know, and the ones who could have warned them had voted to wait for a second opinion. Renna reached the sixth arm, and she did not tell them at first. This was another decision she would examine for the rest of her life. She told herself it was because a warning that could not be acted upon was only a cruelty, that to tell a quarry city of Osik that a thing was coming in 8 years to eat their world, with no ships to run and nowhere to run to, was to steal 8 years of peace and give nothing in return. There was truth in that, but there was also cowardice in it, and she knew that too, and she carried both. So she did what she could do. She flew the line. She surveyed the verge from the near side, close as she dared, and she watched the distortion the way a keeper watches a rising tide, and every day she sent her observations back toward the Chamber of Common Voices, type-beamed and time-stamped and impossible to lose, so that the record would be true whether or not anyone ever read it. She was building a case that no one had asked for a trial that had already been decided, against a defendant that did not know or care that it was on trial. And the distortion came on. It did not hurry, it did not slow. It ate light, and it ate matter, and it grew, exactly as she had told them it would, on exactly the vector she had drawn in red across their careful stars. And the years began to fall away one after another like the pages of a book that only one person in the galaxy was reading. In the second year of her keeping, Renna Vos was no longer entirely alone. The change came slowly, as most true changes do. It began with the quarry cities of Veth, where an Osik engineer named Sethra of the Bright Cleaving intercepted one of her type-beamed reports by accident, and being curious in the way that made the Osik good at cutting stone, decided to answer it. The Osik were not a people who acted on the observation of one. But Sethra was young, as the Osik reckoned age, only 200 years grown, and had not yet fully hardened into the certainty of his elders, and when he ran Renna's data against his own instruments, he found that the numbers agreed, and this troubled him. He came to her ship. It was not easy. The Osik did not fly small craft well, and he arrived at the Vigil Asterisk in a mining shuttle that smelled of hot rock and had to be talked through the docking by Renna herself, chime by chime. When his translucent bulk finally settled into her cargo hold, filling half of it, the first thing he said was, "You are the human from the chamber, the one they filed under provisional designation." "You heard about that." "The Osik hear everything," said Sethro. "We simply do not do anything about most of it. I have come to do something. Show me the thing that is coming to eat my world." She showed him. He watched for a long time, chiming softly to himself, and when it was done he said, "The council is correct that one observer is not enough. So now there are 2. I will give you my instruments and my quarry network and my young. We will watch it together. And when there are enough of us watching, perhaps the council will find that it can no longer file us under provisional designation." That was how the watch began. Not as a rescue, because there was nothing yet to rescue anyone with, but as an act of witness that refused to be alone. Sethro brought the Osik quarry network, 10,000 seismic and gravitational sensors scattered across the crust of Veth, and when Renna aimed them all at the verge, she got a picture of the distortion sharper than anything a single survey ship could produce. He brought his young, too, the vat-grown Osik children, hundreds of them, silicate and slow and endlessly patient, who took to the work of watching the sky the way human children took to games, and who began, in their chiming choral way, to sing the distortion's approach as a kind of grim nursery rhyme that measured the years in verses. Word spread the way it does among poor and provincial worlds, which is to say from ship to ship and quarry to quarry, ahead of any official channel. A Thelite gardener named Sun on Coldwater heard the Osik children singing on an open band and worked out what they were counting and wept for a full day in her red orchard, and then packed a case and took passage to the Vigil and offered Renna the only thing she had, which was seed. "If the worlds are to be eaten," said Sun on Coldwater, who was old even by Thelite reckoning, "then let something of them be saved that is not merely a record. A record is a memory of a garden. I can give you the garden." And here is where the shape of Renna's keeping changed, and became the thing it was always going to be. She had come to the 6th arm to make the record true, but a record, as the Thelite gardener said, is only a memory. standing in her cargo hold with a case of seed in her hands. 28 years old now and no longer quite so certain that witness was enough, Renna Vos understood that if the Council would not save these worlds, and if she could not save these worlds, she could at least save the worlds, the living substance of them, the seed and the spawn and the song, the things that could not be reconstructed from a data slate no matter how true the record. She could build an ark. Not a grand ark, not a fleet of shining vessels carrying millions to safety, because that was beyond her and always would be. The Vigil Asterisk was a survey ship. She could not carry 1,000,000 people, but she could carry a garden. She could carry the vat culture of a quarry city. She could carry seed and spore and gene and song, the irreducible seeds of 40 worlds, so that even if the worlds themselves were eaten, the pattern of them would not be lost. She could carry the future in a hold, and hold it against the day the eating stopped. So the Vigil changed. Over the 3rd and 4th years of the keeping, the blunt gray survey ship grew. She grew the way a coral grows, by accretion, one desperate donation at a time. The Ossic quarry cutters came in their mining shuttles and welded new holds to her flanks, great pressurized domes of quarried stone and salvaged hull plate, and inside the domes they built the cold vaults and the gene banks and the seed libraries. The Thelite gardeners came and built the growing halls, terraces of red soil under salvaged sun lamps, where Sun-On Coldwater and her people planted the orchards of the settlement moons in miniature, so that the trees would be alive and not merely stored. The human colonists, when they finally learned, and Renna did tell them in the 4th year, because by then there was at last something she could offer them besides grief, sent their livestock embryos and their crop strains and their libraries, and a handful of their young to tend them. The V-hurl of the gas giant hives sent the queen's eggs, sealed in amber resin, and a cast of drone keepers to guard them. By the 5th year, the Vigil Asterisk was no longer a ship that one person flew. She was a small drifting town, a barnacled gray mass of welded domes and growing halls and cold vaults, crewed by a few hundred souls of 5 species, and at the center of her still was the original blunt survey wedge. And at the center of that was Renna Vos, who was 31 years old and who had never stopped sending her time-stamped reports back toward the Chamber of Common Voices, every single day, into a silence that had not once been broken. She was the keeper. That title had grown too, without anyone deciding it should. She was the keeper of the record, and the keeper of the ark, and the keeper of the watch. And increasingly, though it sat uneasily on her, she was the keeper of the people who had gathered around her, the ones who had chosen to spend the last years of their worlds building a lifeboat for the pattern of those worlds, instead of fleeing to whatever crowded refuge the great powers might grudgingly offer. They called her the keeper, and they meant it kindly, and it frightened her, because a keeper who fails does not merely fail. A keeper who fails loses the thing she was keeping. And still the Council did nothing. This was the part that Renna could not make peace with. In the long ship nights when the growing halls dimmed, and the Ossic children's song wound down to its final drowsy verses. It was not that the Council had considered the threat and judged it survivable, that she could have understood, even hated cleanly. It was that the Council had not considered it at all. Her reports arrived in the Chamber's archives and were logged and filed under the provisional designation and never read, because reading them was no one's assigned task, and in an institution 11,000 years old, a thing that is no one's assigned task simply does not happen. The distortion in the quiet verge was, as far as the Galactic Council was concerned, a note in a catalog awaiting a second opinion. The second opinion was being generated, in exhaustive and desperate detail, by a keeper and 10,000 Ossic sensors and a chorus of silicate children, and it was arriving in the archive every single day, and no one had been assigned to look. In the 6th year, Renna tried again. She could not go to the chamber herself. She would not leave the ark, would not leave the watch, and in truth the Vigil could no longer make jumps, weighted down as she was with the accreted mass of 40 worlds' salvation. So she did the only thing left. She compiled 6 years of data, 6 years of the distortion's inexorable approach measured by 10,000 sensors, and she formatted it as a formal corroborating observation from the combined survey authorities of the Sixth Arm, OSIC, Theli, human and V-Hurl, 4 independent species, 4 independent instruments, the very thing the Council had said it required, and she filed it as a petition for emergency session. The reply came back in the standard form, and Renna read it aloud to the assembled keepers of the Ark, standing on a growing hall terrace under the red sun lamps, because she felt they had earned the right to hear it in her own voice. The Chamber of Common Voices acknowledges receipt of a petition for emergency session from the survey authorities of the Sixth Arm, she read. The petition concerns an anomaly currently held under provisional designation. Council procedure requires that petitions for emergency session be sponsored by a delegate of standing. The survey authorities of the Sixth Arm do not hold delegate standing. The petition is therefore returned without prejudice. The petitioners are encouraged to seek sponsorship through the appropriate regional channels and to resubmit at a future session should sponsorship be obtained. She lowered the slate. No one on the terrace spoke. The OSIC children had stopped their song. Sun on Coldwater, very old now and stooped among her red trees, made a sound that the Theli make instead of weeping, a low sustained note like wind over the mouth of a jar. "They want a sponsor," said Sethro of the Bright Cleaving at last, and his chiming had gone flat and hard, the sound of stone under strain. "A delegate of standing, to tell them the thing that 10,000 of my censors in 6 years of watching cannot tell them, because the 10,000 censors do not have a seat in the room." "Yes," said Renna. "Then we will not get one," said Sethro, "because a delegate of standing has a homeworld that is not being eaten, and a homeworld that is not being eaten does not spend its standing on the worlds that are. This is how it has always been. The Council does not save the worlds at the edge. It saves itself, and it calls the saving of itself stability, and it files the edge under provisional designation." Renna did not argue with him, because he was right, and because she had known it since the day she walked out of the chamber past the delegates rising to discuss tariffs. She looked out over the growing hall, over the red terraces and the cold vaults and the sealed amber eggs, and the hundreds of people who had given up their worlds last years to build this strange gray ark, and she made the third of the great decisions of her life. "Then we stop asking," she said. "We have asked for 6 years. We have been polite for 6 years. We have filed our petitions and sought our sponsors and formatted our data to their standards, and we have been correct, and being correct has saved no one. So we stop asking. We finish the ark. We save what we can save. And when the thing arrives, we will be here and we will be ready, and we will not need their permission to have been right." There was a silence, and then the OSIC children began, very softly, to sing again. Not the counting song this time, not the grim nursery rhyme of the approaching years, but something new, something that Sethro said afterward was the oldest of the OSIC quarry hymns, the one the cutters sang when they had committed to a cut too deep to abandon. The one that meant, we are past the point of turning back, and so we go forward, and we go forward together. The distortion in the quiet verge was, by then, close enough that on the darkest ship nights, if you knew where to look, you could see it with an unaided eye, a patch of the sky where the stars were wrong, bent and doubled and shifted toward colors the stars did not emit. It was, on the timeline Renna's instruments had drawn 8 years before in the Chamber of Common Voices, 2 years and 4 months from the first inhabited world. It was as she had told them it would be, exactly and to the day as she had told them it would be. And 2 years and 4 months before it reached the quarry cities of Veth, on the far side of the galaxy, in the pale glowing dome of the Chamber of Common Voices, the Council was discussing a proposal to standardize the calendar glyphs used in interspecies trade contracts, a matter which had been before the Chamber for 140 years, and which the delegates felt, with the serene patience of the eternally unsurprised, was finally approaching resolution. There is a thing that happens to a person who is proven right too late, and Renna Vos lived inside it for 8 years, and it is worth describing, because the council never understood it, and understanding it is the whole of the story. To be dismissed and then to be vindicated is, in the tellings, a triumph. The hero warns the fools ignore her, the disaster comes, and the hero stands over the wreckage with the terrible clean satisfaction of having been correct. Renna had imagined that satisfaction in the early days, in the long transit to the sixth arm. She had imagined the moment when the council would come crawling, when Facet of the ninth cleaving would rise in the chamber and say her name, and she had told herself that the imagining kept her warm. It did not keep her warm. When the moment came, when the Ossic delegate did rise and did say her name into the record that never forgot, it brought her nothing at all, because by then she had learned what being right actually cost, and the cost was not paid by the fools. The cost was paid by the people the fools were supposed to protect. Being right had not saved one vat of Ossic young. Being right had not planted one red tree. Being right was a thing that happened to Renna Vos privately in the dark, while a world died in front of her, and it was the most useless thing she had ever possessed, and she came, over the 8 years, to despise it a little, the way you despise a tool that is beautiful and does no work. So she stopped trying to be right, and started trying to be useful, and this was the quiet transformation at the center of the keeping, the one that no report captured, because reports do not capture the difference between a person who wants to win an argument and a person who has given up on the argument entirely and gone to do the work instead. The work was endless. An ark, it turned out, was not a thing you built once and then flew. It was a thing you built every single day, because the substance of 40 living worlds does not sit quietly in a cold vault. The vat cultures of Veth needed their broth balanced to a chemistry that only 3 living Ossic still fully understood, and Sethro spent his nights teaching it to the human and Theli keepers, so that the knowledge would not die if the 3 Ossic did. The red trees of sun on cold water needed a cycle of light and dark, and cold that the salvaged sun lamps could barely hold, and when a lamp failed, they failed often, being salvage. A whole terrace could die in an afternoon, and did, twice, and each time the old Theli gardener made her low sustained note and then, without a word, began again, because beginning again was the only alternative to stopping, and stopping was not a thing the keepers of the ark permitted themselves. The V-hurl amber eggs needed to be turned, by hand, in a sequence the drone keepers guarded as a sacred trust. The human gene libraries needed their power held stable to a tolerance that the Vigil *S aging reactor could not quite promise, and so someone had to watch the reactor, always in shifts, through every ship night of 8 years. Renna took the worst shifts herself. She did not have to. There were enough keepers by the 5th year that the burden could have been shared evenly. She took them anyway, the deep night reactor watches, the failing lamp emergencies, the broth balancing when the 3 Ossic were exhausted, because she had learned something about being a keeper that she could not have articulated to the council in 11 minutes or 11 hours. She had learned that the people who had come to the ark had come because of her, because a young human had crossed 19 jumps and refused to go home, and that a leader who asks others to give up their world's last years must be seen to give up more, must be the first into the dark watch and the last out of it, or the whole fragile thing dissolves into grievance and despair. She was 31 and 32 and 33, and she was tired in a way that went past the body into some deeper reserve, and she did not let it show, and this too was part of the keeping. And she was afraid. This is the thing that must be said, because the tellings that came later made her into something bloodless and certain, a figure carved on a wall, and she was not that. She was a young woman who was afraid nearly all the time. She was afraid of the distortion, which had frightened her alone on the 200th day and frightened her more with every world it unmade. She was afraid of the reactor failing. She was afraid of the lamps. She was afraid, most of all, of the moment she could feel coming down the vector like weather, the moment when the ark would be full and the tide would be close, and there would be some final price that only she could pay, because she was the one who had stood closest to the dark and knew its ways. She did not know yet what that price would be. She only knew, with the certainty that had never once been wrong about the distortion, that it was coming, and that when it came she would pay it, because a keeper who will not pay the last price is not a keeper, but only a person who kept things for a while, and then, at the end, kept herself. She wrote none of this in the reports. The reports were data, vectors and mass estimates and sensor logs, type-beamed and time-stamped into a silence 8 years deep. But she kept another record too, a private one, not for the council and not for the archive, and in it she wrote the things a keeper cannot say aloud to the people who are counting on her. She wrote the fear. She wrote the names of the elders of Veth who would not come. She wrote the 2 afternoons the red terraces died. She wrote once in the 6th year after the council returned her emergency petition for want of a sponsor, "I do not think anyone is coming. I think it is going to be us, alone, all the way to the end." And then, underneath, in a different hand, later, "Good. Let it be us. We are enough. We have to be enough because we are what there is." The keepers of the ark did not all agree, and this too the telling smoothed away, and it should not be smoothed, because the disagreement was where the keeping proved itself. There was a human colonist, a young man named Dahl who had come aboard with his people's crop strains, and Dahl did not believe in the ark. He believed in flight. "We are building a museum," he said to Renna in the 5th year on a reactor watch, "and a museum is a thing you make for the dead. If we spent half this effort on engines we could run, really run, ahead of the thing, forever if we had to. Why are we gathering seed when we should be gathering speed?" "Because seed is the thing that can't run," Renna said. "You can run, your people can run. The council fleet, when it finally comes, can carry the living. But the pattern, the thing that makes your people and not just a crowd of survivors, that has no engine of its own, it can only go where someone carries it. If we all run, Dahl, we live, and everything that made us worth saving stays behind and dies. The ark isn't a museum for the dead. It's a promise to the not yet born. It's the thing that lets the people who run be a people when they stop running, instead of just a frightened crowd with no world and no seed and no song." Dahl did not answer for a long time. Then he said, "My grandmother used to say a people without its seed is just weather. It blows where the wind takes it and then it's gone." And he stayed, and he tended the crop strains for 3 more years, and when the near worlds died he did not run, and Renna never forgot that she had almost lost him to despair in the 5th year and had kept him with a single true thing said on a reactor watch. That was what keeping was, she came to understand. It was not the grand gesture. It was the true thing said at the right moment to the person about to give up, 100 times, 1,000 times, through 8 years of dark, until the true things added up to an ark. The Ossic children grew. This was the strangest and most hopeful thing aboard the Vigil Asterisk, and it deserves its own telling. The Vat Young of Veth, saved out of a world before it died, grew at the slow silicate pace of their kind, and they grew up knowing nothing of Veth as a place, only Veth as a song, and Veth as a vault of sleeping cultures, and Veth as the reason the ark existed. They were the first generation of a people to be born entirely in exile, on a barnacled gray survey ship welded over with quarry stone, and they were not sad children. That surprised the human keepers, who expected sorrow. They were fierce and curious and endlessly, chimingly alive, and they took the counting song their elders had made in grief and turned it into a game, racing each other to name the years, and they treated the whole vast tragedy of their inheritance as the perfectly ordinary condition of the universe, which for them it was. Renna watched them and understood something about survival that 11,000 years of council governance had never grasped, that a pattern kept alive is not a monument to what was lost. It is a beginning. The children of Veth were not the end of a dead world. They were the first of a new one, and they did not need anyone to grieve for them, because they were too busy being alive. It was one of those children, a young one named Bright Thunder Coldlight, grown quick and clever even by the standards of her fierce cohort, who asked Renna the question that the keeper carried with her to the end. It was in the 7th year, after the near worlds had begun to die and before the far ones had begun to empty, and the child had watched Renna send her nightly report into the 8-year silence, and she chimed, in the human tongue she had learned to be polite, "Keeper, why do you still send them? They never answer. My elders say the council filed us under provisional designation. Why do you keep telling the record to someone who does not read it?" And Renna, 33 years old and tired past the body, knelt down to the child's level and said the truest thing she knew. "Because the record isn't for them, bright under cold light. I used to think it was. I used to send it hoping they'd read it and be ashamed and act. They never did. But I kept sending it, and somewhere in there I understood who it was really for. It's for you. It's for whoever comes after. The council may never read a word of it. But someday, a long time from now, someone will, someone young, someone the powerful have dismissed, standing alone in front of a thing no one believes in, and they'll find 8 years of a keeper who was there, telling the truth into the dark every single night whether anyone answered or not. And they'll know they're not the first. They'll know it can be done. That's what the record is for. It's a light I'm leaving on for someone I'll never meet, so they won't have to stand in the dark thinking they're the only one who ever did." The child considered this in her slow, silicate way, and then she chimed the phrase her people used to mark a thing worth keeping, and she went and taught it to the other children, and they added a verse to the counting song, a verse about a light left on in the dark for someone who would come later, and they were singing it, all of them, on the day the distortion crossed at last into the outer system of Veth, and the price began, in earnest, to come fully due. The price came due at Veth. Renna had known it would come there first. She had drawn the red line herself, in the chamber, 8 years before, and the line had touched the Ossic quarry world first of all. But knowing the shape of a thing is not the same as standing in front of it, and when the distortion finally crossed into the outer system of Veth, in the 8th year of the keeping, Renna Vos learned the difference. She had brought the ark as close as she dared. Not to the world. There was nothing the vigil could do for the world, but close enough to receive the last of it, the final transmissions from the 10,000 sensors, the last of the Vat cultures ferried up by mining shuttle, the final chime of a civilization that had grown its young slowly in warm mineral broth for 400,000 years. Sethrov the Bright Cleaving stood beside her on the observation deck, his translucent bulk gone still, and together they watched the thing arrive. It did not roar. That was what Renna could never make anyone understand afterward in the tellings that came later. There was no fleet of alien warships, no beam of annihilating fire, no drama that a species could rally against. The distortion simply crossed into the system, and where it passed, the light of the stars behind it went wrong, bent and doubled and shifted, and the outer comets of Veth, the great slow ice balls that the Ossic had named and sung to for ages, drifted into the wrong light and did not come out the other side. They did not shatter. They did not burn. They entered the smear in the sky, and the smear grew fractionally larger, and the comets were simply no longer anywhere, not as matter, not as energy, not as anything an instrument could name. "It is not destroying them," said Sethro very quietly. "I have watched your recordings 1,000 times, and I told myself I understood. I did not understand. It is not destroying them, Keeper. It is unmaking them. It is reaching into the place where a thing is a thing, and it is taking away the being a thing, and what is left is not wreckage. What is left is nothing. There is a difference, and I feel it in my stone, and I have no chime for it." Renna had no words for it either. She had watched it swallow a single comet alone on the 200th day of her survey, and it had frightened her then. Watching it swallow a solar system's worth of comets, and then the outer moons, and then, as the days ground on and the thing came inexorably inward, the great ringed gas giant that the Ossic children had sung about in their counting rhyme was something for which no amount of prior fright had prepared her. Each thing it unmade made it fractionally larger. It did not slow. It did not tire. It had been growing since before she was born, out in the dark of the quiet verge, and it grew now, and it came on. The evacuation of Veth was not an evacuation. That word implies somewhere to go, and ships to go in, and time. There was very little of any of these. The Ossic were a heavy, slow, planet-bound people. Their young could not survive outside the vats. Their cities were carved into the crust of a world that could not be moved. What could be saved was the pattern, the vat cultures, the gene lines, the 10,000 sensors worth of memory, the quarry hymns, the young that could be moved in their broth. All of this Sethro and Renna, and the keepers of the Ark took aboard the Vigil in the last frantic weeks, mining shuttle by mining shuttle, until the cold vaults were full of the sleeping substance of a people, and the growing halls chimed with the songs of vat children who would never touch the crust of the world that had made them. And the elders of Veth would not come. This was the thing that broke something in Renna and set something else in its place. The old Ossic, the hardened ones, the ones who had lived 1,000 years and grown certain as the stone they cut, they would not leave, not out of despair, out of a conviction so deep it looked like serenity. "We are the world," they told Sethro, chiming slow and calm as he begged them in the last days to come aboard. "The young you have saved, the pattern you have saved, that is enough. A world is not carried in a vault cutter. A world is a place where a people has stood. We will stand in ours to the end, and the end will find us standing, and that is not a defeat. Go, keep the young, keep the song. We release you from us." Sethro came back to the Vigil asterisk from that last conversation with his elders, and he did not speak for 3 days. When he spoke again, he said only, "The council could have given them ships, 50 ships, 100. It would have been nothing to the council, a rounding error in a trade budget, and it would have been my whole world. My elders would have come, if there had been somewhere to come to that was not a survey ship welded over with quarry stone. They did not choose to die, Keeper. They chose to die rather than be a burden on a lifeboat too small. That choice was made for them in the Chamber of Common Voices 8 years ago by delegates who filed it under provisional designation. I will remember that. My young will remember that. The song will remember that." The distortion reached the world of Veth in the 9th month of the 8th year of the keeping. Renna stood on the observation deck and made herself watch, because she was the keeper of the record, and the record had to be true, and truth meant not looking away. She watched the wrong light climb the sky of Veth. She watched the quarry cities, the terraced crust, the whole slow silicate world where a people had grown their young in warm broth for 400,000 years, drift into the smear in the sky. She watched it not shatter and not burn. She watched it enter the place where a thing is a thing and have the being a thing taken from it, and she watched the smear grow fractionally larger, and she watched it come on. There was no wreckage to mourn. That was the cruelty of it. Grief needs something to hold, a ruin, a grave, a scar in the sky, and the distortion left nothing. Where Veth had been, there was simply a place where the stars behind it were bent and doubled and wrong. And then, as the thing moved on toward its next world, the stars straightened, and the sky was clean, and it was as though Veth had never been at all. Renna sent the record back toward the Chamber of Common Voices that night, as she had every night for 8 years. The transmission included the full data of the unmaking, the sensor logs, the mass gain, the vector, now unmistakable, now pointed like a spear at the next 40 worlds, and a single line of text that she added herself, the first personal word she had appended to a report in 8 years. "Veth is gone," she wrote. "You had 8 years. I gave you the vector on the first day. There are 39 worlds left on it. You still have time for some of them. Please, look." The reply came 4 days later, type-beamed from the chamber, and it was not from a delegate. It was an automated archival acknowledgement. "Your submission has been received and logged under provisional designation Virgin Anomaly 1, pending corroboration by a chartered survey authority. Thank you for your contribution to the anomaly catalog." Renna read it twice. Then she set the slate down, very gently, because she was afraid of what her hands might do if she did not set it down gently, and she went to find Sethro, and the two of them stood together on the observation deck looking at the clean and empty sky where a world had been, and neither of them said anything at all for a long time. But the council did at last begin to stir, not out of conscience, out of arithmetic. Because Veth had not been at the edge of the galaxy after all. Veth had been the edge of a wound, and the wound was pointed inward, and the delegates of the Chamber of Common Voices governed by never being surprised, and now something had happened that was not in the catalogue, and it had eaten a member world, and it was still moving, and the same instruments that had ignored a keeper for 8 years could not ignore the sudden and permanent silence of an entire Ossic homeworld. An emergency session was called, a true one at last, sponsored not by the survey authorities of the Sixth Arm, who did not hold delegate standing, but by the delegate for the Ossic themselves, facet of the Ninth Cleaving, the same delegate who had risen 8 years before to explain to a young human that the council did not act on the observation of one. He rose again now, in a chamber that was no longer a fifth full but packed to its 11,000 seats, and his chiming had none of the old condescension in it. It had, instead, a sound the translators struggled with, a sound that in a warmer species might have been called dread. 8 years ago, said Facet of the Ninth Cleaving, in the packed and glowing chamber, a petitioner stood on this stone and told us that a thing was coming to eat the worlds of the Sixth Arm. I told her that the council does not act on the observation of one. I was correct that it was the observation of one. I was wrong about everything else. The observation of one has become the silence of a homeworld. Veth is gone. My homeworld is gone. 400,000 years of my people gone, and the thing that ate them is not slowing, and it is coming inward. And the petitioner gave us the vector 8 years ago, and we filed it under provisional designation. He paused, and the great veined walls glowed, and 11,000 delegates held whatever the 11,000 held instead of breath. I do not rise to assign blame, said the Ossic delegate. There is no measure long enough for the blame, and we do not have measures to spare. I rise to tell this chamber that the petitioner was right, and that she is still out there on the vector, with an ark she built from the substance of the worlds we would not defend, and that she is the only being alive who has stood in front of this thing for 8 years and learned its ways. If any of us are to survive what is coming, we will survive it because of her. And the first thing this chamber must do, before it does anything else, is to stop calling her a provisional designation and start calling her by her name. He said her name then, into the Chamber of Common Voices, into the record that never forgot even the things it never read. He said, Renna Vos, keeper of the Sixth Arm, and 11,000 delegates who had never heard of her, who had spent 8 years discussing tariffs and calendar glyphs while she stood alone in front of the dark, learned the name of the young human they had dismissed. In the same hour they learned the price of dismissing her. The council, once it moved with all the vast belated force of an institution 11,000 years old realizing it had been wrong. And the terrible thing, the thing Renna had feared without ever quite being able to name, was that even that vast force was not enough, because the council had spent the 8 years in which it might have mattered discussing tariffs, and 8 years cannot be bought back at any price. They came to her. That was the first sign of how much had changed. A fast courier of the council fleet, a sleek silver needle worth more than every world of the Sixth Arm combined, ran itself half to ruin to reach the vigil where she drifted at the edge of the unmade place that had been Veth, and out of it stepped a delegation of the Chamber of Common Voices, come to consult the provisional designation they had spent 8 years ignoring. Among them was Deep Considered Tide, the speaker, 600 years old and slow and courteous, who had granted her a single measure of 11 minutes and spent 4 of those minutes for her. He stood in the cargo hold of the Vigil Asterisk, the original hold, the one that had smelled of hot rock the day Sethro first came aboard, and he looked at the barnacled gray immensity of the ark around him, the welded domes and the growing halls and the cold vaults full of the sleeping substance of a dead world, and the tall, slow Thelai was quiet for a long time. "You built this," he said at last, "in the years we were not listening." "Yes," said Renna. "How many people can it carry?" "It is not that kind of ark," Renna said. "I could not build that kind of ark. No one could, not in 8 years, not with the resources of the sixth arm, which the Council will note is very little, because the Council spent 11,000 years deciding the sixth arm was the edge. This ark carries the pattern of the worlds, the seed and the spawn and the gene and the song. It cannot carry the people. It was never going to be able to carry the people. If you had given me 8 years and a fleet, I could have carried the people. You gave me 8 years and a note in a catalog, so I carry the pattern." Deep Considered Tide received that without flinching, which Renna respected because a lesser being would have flinched. "Then tell us how to carry the people," he said. "You have stood in front of this thing for 8 years. We have not. Whatever can be done, we will do it now with everything the Council has, and it is a great deal, even now, even late. Tell us what to do." And here the story turns, because Renna Vos, 32 years old, keeper of the sixth arm, who had wanted for 8 years to be listened to, discovered in the moment of finally being listened to that she did not have the answer they wanted. There was no clever thing she had learned in the dark that would stop the distortion. She had learned only that it could not be stopped. She had stood closer to it than anyone alive, and everything she had learned pointed one way. "You can't stop it," she said. "I need you to hear that clearly, because you'll spend lives testing it if you don't. I've tried everything an instrument can try. It doesn't answer force. It doesn't answer energy. Weapons feed it. It unmakes the weapon and the energy of the weapon and grows. It has no core to strike, no engine to disable, no mind to reason with. Or if it has a mind, it is not a mind that has ever once in 8 years given a sign of noticing that anything is watching it or standing in its way. It is not an enemy. It is a condition. It is the unmaking, and it is coming, and the only thing that works against it is distance." "Distance," said Deep Considered Tide. "Distance and time," said Renna. "It moves fast, but it moves at a speed. It is not everywhere at once. Every world on the vector has a date, and I can give you every date to the day because I have been keeping the dates for 8 years. Some of those dates are close. Some are years away still. You cannot save the close ones. There is no longer time to move a planet's people in the days that remain to them, and I will not lie to you and say there is. But the far ones, the worlds 2 years down the vector, 3 years, 4, those you can empty. Those you can save world by world if you begin now and you do not stop, and you do not ever again file a single one of them under provisional designation." She gave them the dates. 8 years of dates, the whole terrible calendar of the vector, world by world down the sixth arm, and Deep Considered Tide took the calendar back to the Chamber of Common Voices. And for the first time in 11,000 years, the Council did a thing it had no protocol for. It began to move people ahead of a disaster it had not seen coming. On the word of a single observer it had spent 8 years dismissing. It was not enough. It could not have been enough. But it was not nothing, and the difference between not enough and nothing was measured in the only unit that mattered, which was the living, and by that measure it was measured in the millions. The near worlds died on schedule. Renna made herself keep the record of each one, because she was the keeper, and because the elders of Veth had taught her that to look away from an ending is to make the ending smaller than it was, and the endings deserved not to be made smaller. The human colonies went, the small stubborn mining and fishing ones, some fleeing in whatever hulls they could crowd into, and some, like the Ossic elders before them, refusing to be a burden on a lifeboat too small and standing in their worlds to the end. The V-Hurl Hive platforms went, drifting into the wrong light in the gas giants, and the drone keepers aboard the Vigil Asterisk sang the hive death in a register too low for human ears, and Renna felt it in the deck plates rather than heard it. The Thelai settlement moons went, the red gardens and the orchards no one had lived to see fruit, and old Sun-On Coldwater, who had planted those same orchards in miniature in the growing halls of the Ark, stood among her saved red trees, and made the low, sustained note of Theli grief until she had no more note to make. And the far worlds, the ones with time, emptied. The council fleet, the great silver fleet that had spent 11,000 years on ceremony and patrol, and had never once been needed for anything so simple and so vast as carrying frightened people away from a rising tide, came at last to the sixth arm in its full glittering strength. 8 years too late for Veth, 8 years too late for the near worlds, but not too late, not quite, not entirely, for the worlds down the vector where time still ran. World by world, on the calendar Renna had kept for 8 years, the fleet arrived ahead of the unmaking and took the people off. Not the pattern this time, but the people themselves, the living millions, into the holds of ships that should have come 8 years sooner and had finally come. Renna watched the fleet work from the observation deck of the Ark, and it was the strangest grief of all, because it was grief braided with something she had almost forgotten the taste of, which was hope. Every world the fleet emptied ahead of the tide was a world she had drawn in red in the chamber 8 years before and been told to file under provisional designation. Every ship that lifted full of the living was a rebuke to the 8 years of silence and also, undeniably, a salvation, and she did not know how to hold both of those at once, so she held them both at once, because that was what a keeper did. Sethro found her there on the deck, watching the silver fleet empty a Theli moon 3 years down the vector. "You could hate them," he said. "The council, it would be just. You have earned the right to hate them, keeper, more than any being alive." "I did hate them," Renna said. "For 8 years. I hated them from the day I walked out of the chamber. And then Veth died and I learned what hating them cost, which was nothing. It did not save one vat of your young, it did not plant one red tree, it did not lift one frightened family off a doomed moon. Hating them was the one thing I could do that changed nothing. So I stopped. Not because they deserve to be forgiven, because the worlds down the vector don't have time for me to hate anybody. Every hour I spend hating the council is an hour I'm not keeping the calendar, and the calendar is the only thing I have that saves anyone." Sethro chimed, low, the sound the Ossic made instead of a long breath. "My elders would have liked you," he said. "They would have said you cut deep and true. It is the highest thing an Ossic can say of anyone." The vector ran on. The distortion came inward, world by world, exactly as Renna had told the chamber it would 8 years before, and behind it now, for the first time, ran the great silver fleet, snatching the living off the worlds with time and leaving behind, on the worlds without it, only the record that the keeper kept. The unmaking did not slow. It did not tire. It grew with each world it took, and it came on, and the vector, Renna knew, the vector she had drawn in red across their careful stars, did not end at the sixth arm. That was the thing she had not said in the chamber 8 years ago, because she had not been certain, and because 11 minutes was not enough time to say the worst thing. The vector did not end at the sixth arm. She had run it forward in the long ship nights, again and again, hoping each time to be wrong, and each time the line came out the same. The vector ran inward through the sixth arm and out the far side and on, across the shipping lanes and the trade compacts and the terraced moons, toward the center of everything. Toward the pale glowing dome carved from a single asteroid, where 11,000 delegates had governed for 11,000 years by never being surprised. The vector ran, at the end, to the chamber of common voices itself. Renna Vos, keeper of the sixth arm, ran the numbers one last time on the night the silver fleet finished emptying the last of the worlds that had time, and the line came out the same as it always had, and she saw, with a clarity that was almost peace, exactly how the price would come due at last, and exactly what she would have to do, and exactly what it would cost her. Between the near worlds and the far, there was a stretch of the vector Renna came to think of as the hinge, the weeks in which the two truths of the keeping stood side by side and could not be reconciled, and had to be carried both at once anyway. On one side of the hinge were the worlds already lost, the ones for whom the Council's awakening had come too late, and their loss was total and left no wreckage and could not be softened. On the other side were the worlds the fleet could still reach, the ones with time, and their salvation was real and vast and undeniable, and had also been bought 8 years too dear. A lesser person would have chosen one truth to live in, would have drowned in the grief of the lost or hidden in the relief of the saved. Renna had learned by then to stand in the doorway of the hinge and hold both truths in her two hands, the dead in one and the living in the other, and to let neither of them go, because that was what the record required, and the record was the last thing she had. She stood there through the whole of it, keeping the calendar, keeping the count, keeping the grief and the hope in their terrible braided balance, and she did not look away from either, not once, all the way to the end of the vector where the last price waited for her. She told the Council about the vector. She did it plainly, the way she had learned to do everything, because there was no longer any measure short enough to waste on softening it. She compiled the projection, and she sent it to deep considered tied, type-beamed and time-stamped, with a single line of text, the second personal word she had ever appended to a report. "The vector does not end at the 6th arm," she wrote. "I have run it 1,000 times. It ends at the Chamber of Common Voices. You have 4 years. This time, please, do not wait for a second opinion. You are the second opinion. Look." And the chamber, which had needed 8 years and a dead homeworld to believe the keeper the first time, believed her at once the second time, because the price of not believing her had a name now, and the name was Veth, and 11,000 delegates had learned it. They evacuated the center of the galaxy. It was the largest movement of living beings in the recorded history of the Council, and it succeeded because a keeper had drawn a red line 8 years too early and kept the calendar ever since, and because the Great Silver Fleet, having finally learned how to carry frightened people away from a rising tide, did not stop when it reached the worlds withstanding. The Chamber of Common Voices was emptied, the trade compacts scattered, the terraced moons at the heart of everything sent their people down the outbound lanes ahead of the unmaking, and the delegates who had governed for 11,000 years, by never being surprised, abandoned the pale glowing dome that had never, in all that time, been threatened by anything. But the pattern of the center could not be carried in a fleet. Renna knew that better than anyone, because she had spent 8 years learning exactly what could and could not be carried. The living could flee. The seed and the spawn and the gene and the song of 10,000 worlds at the heart of the galaxy, the irreducible pattern, the thing that made a saved people more than a crowd of refugees, that could not be loaded onto warships in 4 years. It could only be gathered, slowly and carefully, into holds built for it, by keepers who knew how. So the vigil came inward. She came inward against the vector, the barnacled gray arc heavy with the substance of 40 dead worlds, and she came to the center of the galaxy in the last months before the unmaking, and she did the thing she had learned to do. She gathered the pattern. World by world at the heart of everything, ahead of the tide, the Vigil Asterisk took aboard what the fleet could not carry, until her cold vaults held the sleeping seed of 10,000 worlds, and her growing halls chimed with more life than any single ship had ever held. She became, in those last months, exactly the ark she had built herself to be, on a scale she had never dreamed of when she welded the first quarry dome to her flanks in grief for a world not yet dead. And when the gathering was done, and the unmaking crossed at last into the system of the Chamber of Common Voices, when the wrong light climbed the sky above the pale asteroid where 11,000 delegates had governed for 11,000 years, Renna Vos was there. She had promised at the 200th day of her survey, alone in the dark, someone has to be there when it arrives so that at least the record is true. She had kept every other promise. She kept this one too. Vigil could outrun the distortion. Barely, heavy as she was, but she could. Renna had kept the margins for 8 years and she knew them to the hour. What she could not do was outrun it and gather the last of the pattern both. There was a hold at the heart of the chamber station itself, a vault the Council had built 10,000 years before to preserve the founding record of every member species, the deepest and oldest gene library in the galaxy, the true pattern of everyone. It could not be moved by remote. It had to be taken by hand, chamber by chamber, in the hours the unmaking left, and every hour spent taking it was an hour off the margin the vigil asterisk needed to run. Sethro understood before she said it. He had learned to read her the way the Ossic reads stone. "You have run the margins," he said. "You have run them 1,000 times. Tell me the number, Keeper." "If we take the founding vault, we lose the margin," Renna said. "The vigil gets out with the pattern of the center, all of it, everyone's. But she gets out slow, and she gets out late, and someone has to stay at the station to hold the beam that guides her clear of the wrong light in the dark, because the instruments can't do it and the distortion blinds them at close range. I've stood closer to this thing than anyone alive. I know its ways. I can hold the beam." She said it plainly because there was no measure short enough for anything else. "You take the vigil asterisk out. You take the pattern of 10,000 worlds and 40 more and the young of Veth and sun on cold water's red trees. You take all of it, and you take the people who built it, and you go, and you do not stop, and you do not ever again wait for a second opinion. And I hold the beam." "Keeper." "I built the ark to save the pattern," Renna said. "Not to save myself. I was never the thing that mattered. I was the one who was there. Let me be the one who's there at the end, too. Someone has to be, Sethro. Someone always has to be. That's what a keeper is." He did not argue with her because he was Ossic, and the Ossic did not argue past the point of the cut. He chimed instead, low and long, the deep-cut hymn, the one that meant we are past the point of turning back, and so we go forward and we go forward together. And then at the end, a new verse, one Renna had never heard, and when she asked him what it meant he said, "It is the verse for the one who stays at the cut so the others can go." My elders sang it for themselves on Veth. I did not think I would sing it again so soon. I did not think I would sing it for you. So the vigil asterisk went out, heavy with the pattern of the galaxy's heart, and Renna Vos stayed on the pale asteroid station where 11,000 delegates had governed for 11,000 years, alone at last as she had been at the beginning, and she held the beam. She held it as the wrong light climbed the sky. She held it as the unmaking crossed into the station's own orbit, and the stars behind it went bent and doubled and wrong. She held it as the ancient dome she stood in, the chamber of common voices, where she had been given a single measure of 11 minutes and dismissed, drifted at last into the smear that did not shatter and did not burn, and she watched the beam run true out of the wrong light and into the dark, guiding the vigil clear, guiding the pattern of 10,000 worlds out to where the unmaking could not reach. The last thing her instruments showed her, before the distortion reached the station and reached her, was the vigil asterisk breaking free of the margin, slow and late and heavy, exactly as she had said, but free, out and clear and running. The barnacled gray ark carrying the seed and the spawn and the gene and the song of a galaxy's worth of worlds into the safe dark beyond the vector. She had time to send one last transmission. It went out on the beam, tight and true, to the vigil and to the scattered fleet, and to the archive that never forgot even the things it never read. It was the third and last personal word she ever appended to a report, and it was not for the Council, and it was not a rebuke, because she had stopped hating them at Veth and there was no measure left for it now. "The record is true," she sent. "Keep it that way, keep the pattern, keep the song. Someone will always have to be there at the end, so raise them knowing it and they will not be alone the way I was because they will have been warned. That is the whole of it. Warn them, keep them. Go." And then the wrong light took the chamber of common voices, and the beam, and the keeper who held it. And where the pale asteroid had been for 11,000 years, there was only a place in the sky where the stars were bent and doubled and wrong. And then, as the unmaking moved on down its vector toward the empty center of a galaxy that had, for once, believed its warning in time, the stars straightened, and the sky was clean, and it was as though none of it had ever been there at all. but it had been there. That was the thing the distortion could never unmake, though it unmade the asteroid and the dome and the keeper and left no wreckage to mourn. The record was true. It had been kept true for 8 years by a young woman the council dismissed, and then for the years after by the ark she built, and the people she saved. And it would be kept true now for as long as there were Osik to sing the quarry hymns and Thela to plant the red trees and Vhurl to hatch the amber eggs and humans to fly the blunt gray ships into the dark ahead of the tide. The Galactic Council governed no longer by never being surprised. That certainty had died with Veth and been buried with the Chamber of Common Voices. It governed, in the years that came after, by the harder and humbler virtue the keeper had tried to teach it in 11 minutes and finally taught it in 8 years. That the whole point of a first time is that it is not in the catalog yet, and that when a single voice crosses the dark to warn you of a thing you have never seen, the cost of listening is only a little of your certainty, and the cost of not listening is everything. They built a new chamber in time, out on the safe side of the vector, and they carved into its wall the name of the keeper who had held the beam, so that no delegate could ever again rise to speak without reading it. And when the young of Veth were old enough to understand, the Vat children saved out of a dead world, grown at last to their slow silicate maturity aboard the ark, they were taught the counting song first, the grim nursery rhyme of the years, and then the deep-cut hymn, and then, last of all, the verse for the one who stays at the cut so the others can go. And they sang it. On the anniversary of the day, the wrong light took the Chamber of Common Voices, out into the clean and empty dark where a keeper had once held a beam true so that 10,000 worlds could go on being worlds. Renna Vos was 26 when the council dismissed her, and 36 when the price came fully due, and she was right from the first day to the last. The council paid that price in worlds it could have saved, and years it could not buy back, and a certainty, 11,000 years old, that it would never again be permitted to hold. And the keeper who warned them paid it too, in the end, in the only coin she had ever been willing to spend, which was herself, so that the record would be true, and the pattern would be kept, and the next voice that crossed the dark to warn them would find, at last, a galaxy that had learned to look.